So in this lecture, we are going to dive deep into layer blend modes. Layer blend modes are one of the most powerful tools in Photoshop or any digital painting software, and they allow you to do all sorts of really cool, amazing things that you would never be able to do with traditional media like paper and pencil or oil paint, acrylics, things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through every single layer mode and talk about what it does, when you might use it, or if at all, and how it would affect an image. So we have this base image here, and what we're going to do for each layer mode, we're going to look at it with this overlay here. We have a super saturated color wheel, we have a darker and more desaturated color wheel, and then a lighter desaturated color wheel, and then we have a hue slider here, and then just some base CMYK colors and RGB colors, okay? And we will turn this mode to different layer modes, and you can see how it affects that image underneath. And then we're going to do the same thing with this value scale. We have value scale here, a smooth gradient value, and then just black, midtone, and white, so that you can see how it affects each one. So without further ado, let's just jump in. So the first and main layer mode is called normal. And normal layer mode does exactly what it says. It doesn't change anything. All of the pixels are opaque. Okay. The next one underneath that one is dissolve. You will probably never ever use dissolve because it's a horribly useless layer mode. What it does is, as you lower the opacity on the layer, it's just going to randomly select pixels within the image to remove, to reveal the layer underneath. So at 100% every pixel is there, but as you start to lower the opacity, you can see it starts to remove pixels. And that sort of layered grainy effect, it does the same thing for the values. It's hideous and ugly, and I don't know why anyone would ever use it, but it's there. So those are the two normal settings. You'll probably never use dissolve. You'll use normal all the time. The next category, these ones are called darken. So the first one we'll go with is darken itself. What darken does is it picks between the two layers, the base layer and the new layer, and it looks at whichever value is darker. So if the base layer image has a darker value, it will show that one. And if the top layer has a darker value, it will replace it with whichever is on the new layer. So you can see here in the colors how it's affecting it. On this light circle over here, the main image is darker than the layer on top. And so mostly the lower image is showing through. You can see this really clearly when we come up here to our new layer, if we change this one to darken as well. You can see that white, for example, because the base image is darker than white, every pixel in that base image is darker than white, it's going to remain almost completely unaffected. But as we get over here into the darker section, if we go all the way black, black is darker than everything in the image, so that's what's going to show up. And then when we come into the midtone, it's basically going to almost even everything out, because if there's anything that's lighter than the midtone is going to show up instead. And if there's anything darker than the midtone, that will show up instead. The same on here, you can see in the white section in the bottom right, unaffected, mid-tone, it's sort of medium affected, and then the black, it just goes all the way black. So that's darken. The only time I would really use this is if I need to just darken a whole section, like the whole image is a little bit too light and I want to bring it all down a notch. I rarely, if ever, use this, but it's an option. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is multiply, which is actually one I use all the time. What multiply does is it takes the top layer and multiplies it by the bottom layer. So it will almost always darken everything, but if you get into the white range of things, it's going to have no effect because there's nothing to multiply it with. So like you can see up here where it's really light, it barely has an effect, but when we go dark, it really makes things dark. We can look up here as well. For this layer, you can see it just darkens everything. The reason I like this layer so much and what I mostly use it for is that the darken layer allows you to create shadows while still preserving your value relationships and whatever colors are underneath. So you can see when we turn this one on, if you wanted to make shadows on the mountains or whatever it was, like you can see the sky here, even though it darkens the sky, it still keeps the relationship between the blue and white of the clouds. There's still a difference there. It just makes the whole thing a little darker, which means if you have a painting that you've already done some, maybe you have a creature that has a bunch of cool stripes on it, and now you want to do shadows, instead of using a normal layer and having to go and paint all the shadows and paint around the stripes and then paint a different color for the stripes so those get darker and all those things, you can just take a multiply layer, paint in the shadows, and it will apply equally to both of those things and still have it look like stripes. You can also do this in black and white or color. I think multiply is awesome. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is color burn. This is essentially the burn tool, but on an entire layer. So color burn, to be a little bit more specific, what it's going to do is increase the contrast between the base value and the new value from the new layer. So if you have, for example, this one right here, you could see the contrast between the cloud and the sky gets way more intense, and then it's also going to ramp up the saturation using whatever color you have on your new layer that's on top that's set to color burn. When we do black and white, you'll see that it doesn't have much of an effect because there's not a whole lot of color. It just increases the contrast, and in some areas it's just going to send it black. I don't really find a use for this one. I mean, you could use it selectively where you're like brushing on certain areas with the brush by itself, but you probably won't run into need to use this one very much. All right, linear burn. Linear burn decreases the brightness of the base color based on the value of the blend color. So the result is darker than multiply but less saturated than color burn. Linear burn also produces the most contrast and darker colors than any of the other blending modes in the darker group. Linear burn blends differently when fill opacity is adjusted compared to when opacity is adjusted. So this one here, the fill right here, it's going to have a different effect than when you use just the opacity slider. Once again, it's not one that you'll probably use a lot. It's not a common one, but sometimes if you experiment, you can find interesting, unique uses for it. But so far, the main ones you're going to be using are normal, multiply, and darken occasionally. And then darker color is pretty much exactly like darken, except for it only picks the color, not the value. So it's going to focus on the hue. So you can see, let's look at an example here. The blue here, the blue color is a darker value than all of the shingles on the roof, so it's going to replace it with the blue hue, but it's not actually changing the value. But I mean, it is changing the value, but it's not like darken where it kind of preserves the relationships. It's just going to take anything that is lighter than this blue and fill it in with that blue, whatever is on that layer. So same up here. This whole section of the color wheel is all darker than whatever would normally be in the sky, and so it's just going to replace that with this layer. Same thing with this one. It has a very similar effect to darken because there's no color in these black and white grayscales. So that's everything in our darken section. Let's move on to lighten. The light layers are all pretty much the exact mirror opposite of the darken layer. So lighten, for example, it's like darken, except for it takes the lighter of the two values. So it's going to compare. Anywhere there's something lighter than the layer beneath, it's going to replace it with whatever's on the top layer. And same vice versa. We can go ahead and come up here and look at this one as well. Do lighten. So on this one, black is basically going to have no effect because everything is lighter than black. And white is going to have a full effect because everything's darker than white. Okay. Screen is basically just like multiply, but the opposite. It's going to divide your values. So black is going to have no effect, while white will have an opaque effect. And this is really great for doing highlights sometimes. It can have a little bit of a washed out effect, and so you probably want to use normal a lot of times as well in effort with this. But it can go a good ways in getting you part way there using a screen layer to sort of lighten up areas. We can look at the color version of this. And you can see it's just basically lightening everything. It's dividing it by the lighter value and lightening everything up. Okay. And the darker it gets, the less effect it has. And the lighter it gets, the more effect it's going to have. So that's screen. Another one that's pretty useful. You can use lighten and screen. Color dodge. So let's go to color dodge here. Color dodge blends differently when the fill is adjusted compared to opacity. So that's another one where when you use this, it's going to change how it affects. It's going to change the intensity of it. And the blending mode gives you a brighter effect than screen by decreasing the contrast between the color base and the blend colors. So the other one increases the contrast. This is going to decrease it by bringing up your values. So the darker areas are going to get brought up to match closer, because you can see here it's a lot darker, and that's going to lighten everything up. Same with this layer. If we bring that one up to color dodge, it's just going to decrease the contrast by brightening everything up and bringing it to a closer level. Another one that you probably won't use a ton, but something I do like to use it for actually is creating light bloom effects. So if you use a soft airbrush, use a nice reddish orange color and brush this in over the top of a highlight, it'll sort of make the light look blown out. And we can actually sort of see an example of this right here on these clouds, for example. If we turn this off, the cloud just looks like regular light. But when this is on top of it, it kind of blows out the highlight and makes it look really hot, like the sun is really beating down on it. And you can do this to have some really cool effects in a painting as well. I mean, it's kind of over the top with the colors here. It's hard to see an example, but that's a good use for color dodge. I use that frequently. Linear dodge, once again, pretty much the opposite of linear burn. Same with lighter colors, pretty much the opposite of darker color. It's just going to find the lighter values and replace it instead of the darker values. Same with this. Once again, not one that I'm going to really use ever, honestly, but it's there as an option. All right, next, overlay. Overlay is another layer that I find really useful. Overlay is basically a mix between multiply and screen. So what overlay is going to do with screen, it's going to divide all the lighter values and make them lighter, and multiply is going to divide all the multiply all the values and make them darker. Well, overlay, what it's going to do is anything higher than 50% on the value scale, anything lighter than 50% is going to be treated as a screen layer. Anything darker than 50% is going to be treated as a multiply layer. So you can see the midtone right here has no effect. Midtone gray does nothing to the image. And then as we move darker, it's going to be treated as a multiply. And as we move lighter, it's going to be treated as a screen. However, it does not have as intense of effect, because if we were doing multiply all the way, black would just be completely black and white would be completely white. So it's kind of knocked down about 50%, but just know that 50% gray will have no effect. Anything above 50% will be treated like a screen. Anything below will be treated as a multiply. You can see the same thing with the color. That 50% gray right there in the middle, you can see that it basically just shows up oh, actually, sorry, that's not even the right layer mode. I was like, what's going on? There we go. Everything that's 50% gray has no effect. It's just the base image. And then once again, all the stuff that's darker, like this circle, is being treated like a multiply layer. This circle is being treated like a screen layer. And this circle in the middle is kind of a mix of both, because some of the values get darker and some of the values get lighter. And it just affects it what's the word? Accordingly. So, next, after overlay, we have soft light. Soft light is a lot like overlay. It applies either a darkening or lightening effect depending on the luminance values. So think of darken and lighten. It's the same thing as that with overlay in regards to screen and multiply, only instead it's a darken and lighten layers. So basically anywhere that there's a lighter value, it will replace it, and anywhere there's a darker value, it will replace it once they're either above or below mid-tone. Okay, so basically identical to screen, or basically identical to overlay, just with the darken and lighten layer abilities instead of the multiply and screen layers. Another one, I mean, you'll use it about as often as you would use darken and lighten. Not one I use very often, but it is an option. Hard light combines the multiply and screen blending modes using the brightness values of the blend layers to make its calculations. So it's going to have a much more intense effect. It's going to go all the way. So if we change this one back, you'll see this is not just based off of that, overlay is not as intense because it kind of stops at 50% on either side. This is going to go all the way. So almost identical to overlay, just with way more intensity. So anything that's white is going to go all the way to white. Anything that's black is going to go all the way to black. Anything that's neutral gray in the middle is going to have no effect on it. But basically the same as overlay, just much more intense. Next one is vivid light. So vivid light is like an extreme version of overlay and soft light. So anything darker than 50% gray is darkened, and anything lighter than 50% gray is lightened. It's one of those ones where you're going to want to use the opacity to bring it down, but it just gives you way more intense control so that you can sort of blend with it and work with it how you want. Linear light, That's like the same thing, but for color dodge linear dodge and linear burn. Basically the same thing. Anything above 50 is going to be linear dodge, and anything below 50 is going to be linear burn. Not something to use, so that's pretty much all I need to know about it. Pin light, it's like darken and lighten blending mode simultaneously, and it basically gets rid of all midtones. Another one that you're probably not going to use. Hard mix is one that it applies the blend by adding the value of each red, green, blue channel into the blend layer to the corresponding red, green, blue channel in the base layer. So you'll lose a lot of detail. The colors can only be black, white, or any of the 6 primary colors. So like these colors down here are the only ones that are going to be affected by it. Anything that's sort of in between is not really going to make a difference. And you can see, same with black and white, if we come down here to pin light. And then, oh, sorry, I was getting mixed up. That's hard mix. That's hard mix that does that. Another one, those ones, we don't really need to go over pin light, hard mix, linear light. Probably never use those. Difference is going to subtract the values from each other. It's kind of weird to think of it as a subtraction when you're using colors, but if you think of it in the terms of software, each color has a number, and what it's doing is taking the subtraction of the color code of whatever is on top and subtracting the one from the one below it to get it with a new value. It's really technical and not super great for digital painting. It's mostly for photography, so it's another one that you're not going to probably run into very often. But you can download this file and you'll have the base layer and then these two, the value scale and the color layer, and you can mess around with all these and see for yourself, but it's just subtracting the values from each other. Exclusion is, instead of just subtracting, it's basically removing the values. So it's kind of like difference, but blending with white inverts the base color values, while blending with black produces no change. So if you blend with 50%, it's going to make gray. If you're going to do white, it's going to make it lighter. And if you do black, it's going to make no difference. That's exclusion right there. And then you can see up here, same thing. Then subtract is just going to remove that value from the layer beneath. So for example, with white, it's going to take all the white, anything lighter, or sorry, anything darker than white is going to get removed. Anything darker than black will get removed. So if you paint black on this layer, nothing will happen. If you paint white, it's going to take all of that away from the layer beneath, and anything in between will respond accordingly. Same with this one. Once again, not one you'll probably use too often, if ever. Divide. Similar concept. It's just going to divide those values out. Same with this one. It might be a little bit confusing. You just need to remember that you're thinking of these, the program is thinking of these colors in terms of numbers. And so that's how they're coming up with these formulas and calculations. You just need to understand the end effect. Okay. And then, so most of those you probably won't end up using. But yeah, difference, exclusion, subtract, divide, I never use any of those. But these last ones I do. So hue is a cool one. All it does is whatever layer is on top, it's going to affect the layer beneath by changing the hue of it. That's it. So it's not going to adjust the value of anything. It's not going to adjust the saturation of anything. All it's going to do is replace the hue of what was ever underneath it with the hue of whatever is on top. So for example, the hue of the gray is completely neutral. There is no hue, and so no hue is going to show up. But in those areas where you have like the pink or the green or blue, it's going to take the hue beneath it and change it to the new hue. So like this area over here, all the values are preserved, right? You have all your darks are the exact same value, all your lights are the same value, and the only thing that's changed is the hue, which means that on our black and white, it's not really going to do anything. It's just going to make everything black and white because there's no hue in a black and white layer. Next one. Saturation, the exact same thing as hue, but instead of changing the hue, it's only focusing on the saturation. So for example, this beginning or this end circle and the beginning circle, it didn't have a very high saturation, and so what it's just going to do is take the base layer and pump the saturation of that base layer to match whatever layer is on top. But this one in the middle had a really high saturation, so everything in this layer, its saturation is going to get pumped up. It's not changing the hue at all, it's not changing the value, it's only affecting the saturation, which is why where it's mid-tone gray, there's just gray because there's zero saturation there. But in this middle circle, really high saturation. This gradient here, lots of high saturation. And in these bottom ones, all of these colors are really highly saturated, so everything got pumped up. If we go to the black and white layer, you'll see that the saturation layer doesn't do anything. Well, I mean, it turns to black and white, but that's because there's no saturation there. Next one is color. Another one that I like using. Color basically just takes whatever color is on top and adds it to the image, and this is going to include saturation and hue, just not value. So value won't change, but your saturation and your hue will change. So you can see here it's affecting both of those, same on this side. So it's just basically sort of combining hue and saturation together in one layer. So when we go to the black and white, it's going to have no effect as well. And then the last one here, luminosity. It's only going to affect the value, basically. Another one that you'll probably never use. Oh, sorry, I had that layer on. There you go. Another one you'll probably never use. It's just going to change the lightness while still preserving the hue and saturation. Okay. And you can see on this one as well. So there you go. Those are all the layer modes. Just to recap, the ones you're probably going to use the most. Normal, you'll use just for normal painting. Darken is good for darkening things up. Multiply is great for shadows. Lighten is great for lightening things up. Screen is good for highlights. Color dodge I like to use for light blooms. Overlay is good for color grading a whole entire image down or up. Soft light and hard light you can use for highlights sometimes. Hue, all these ones we pretty much never use. And color is really good for coloring a black and white image. So that's it for this lecture. I know it's a lot to take in. The real truth is that the more you paint and the more you experiment with these layers, you'll get a way better grasp than just listening to me explain them to you. Try experimenting, try using different layers, see how they affect your image. That's going to give you a way better grasp than just listening to a lecture on it. But now you know the sort of the basics, the fundamentals of how layers work and what they do. That is it for this lecture. I will see you guys in the next one.
Was it your last one?